A convincing majority, defying predictions and early polls, Britain's Conservative Party has won a resounding victory. The Scottish Nationalist Party also took a record number of seats in Scotland. What does this election mean for Great Britain and the EU? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Dareen Abughaida. It was billed as the most unpredictable UK election in decades, and the results have proven that. David Cameron's Conservative Party has won a majority in Thursday's general election, beating out the Labour Party and grabbing at least 330 of the 650 seats in Parliament. And the surprise doesn't end there. The Scottish National Party has all but swept away Labour from one of its traditional strongholds, becoming the third largest party in Parliament. Declaring victory, David Cameron said he hoped to form a government in the next few days. Meanwhile, the Labour leader Ed Miliband announced his resignation, saying he was deeply sorry and that Labour would one day bounce back. So now that the results are in, what does the Conservative win mean for the big campaign issue, the UK economy? And with Cameron saying he'll hold a referendum on Britain's membership in the EU, how do these results bode for Europe? And finally, how will Scotland's SNP use its surge in the polls to push forward its main agenda of independence? Well, this is what David Cameron had to say after his party's victory.
This is clearly a very strong night for the Conservative Party. I think we've had a positive response to a positive campaign about safeguarding our economy, about creating jobs, about a record in government over the last 5 years, but above all, a plan for the next 5 years, and based on clear values.
Let's bring in our panel. All our guests joining us from London. Tom Costley is a pollster at Britain's largest polling organisation, TNS. That's where he is also Group Director for Scotland. Simon Mabon is a lecturer in politics and government at Lancaster University, as well as a researcher at the Foreign Policy Centre. He's in our Westminster studio by the Parliament. And Matthew Goodwin is an associate fellow at the British think tank Chatham House, whose research specialises in voting behaviour within British politics. Welcome to you all to Inside Story. So, Tom, not the scenario that was expected. The polls told us we'd be seeing. Would you say that the polls were off the mark completely?
They weren't off the mark completely, but there's no doubt that the extent of the Conservative lead over the Labour Party was much greater than was predicted in some of the polls leading up to the end. Most of the polling companies had the Conservatives in the lead. It was the size of that lead which perhaps was somewhat surprising.
Matthew, you're nodding with what Tom is saying. To you, was there any indication that this would be the result of the election?
Well, no, I think this was an election where pollsters and forecasters are going to have to sit down and think very hard about perhaps the methodology that they used and the debate that we had before the election. If you look at every major forecast, for example, in the academic arena before this election, I think every single one of those forecasts massively underestimated the number of seats for the Conservative Party. Even the opinion polls on which many of those forecasts are based also significantly underestimated the Conservative Party support and overestimated support in quite a lot of the constituencies for the Liberal Democrats. So, you know, on the one hand, we've had this debate about how opinion polling and forecasting is entering into this new era of sophistication. On the other hand, we seem to have had a picture painted which is quite different from the reality of the election.
Simon, there was a surge of support for UKIP, for example, and there is the question of why people turn to some of those smaller parties.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And I think in the case of UKIP, particularly in the northeast, people are turning to UKIP because of the legacy of the Tories and their influence on the region. I'm from Doncaster, and the area around Doncaster was really hard hit during the Thatcher government, and I know from speaking to various people that they were incredibly reluctant to vote for a Conservative MP, but they also found the message from UKIP quite appealing. And I think that explains why they've started to pick up a lot of votes in the northeast in particular.
And Tom, it'll be interesting looking ahead, Tom, about the appointments that Cameron makes and the makeup of his cabinet.
Very much so, but if you don't mind, could I just challenge Matthew's point he made about the Liberal Democrats?
Yes.
I can only comment for TNS, my own company, but we got the share of vote for the Liberal Democrats just about right. Our only fault, and I have to admit that, yes, we, as with many of the other polling organisations, underestimated the Conservative vote. But for the Liberal Democrat share of vote, for the UKIP share of vote, we were pretty nearly on the nail. And so, yes, I believe we have to look at what happened regarding this underestimate of the Conservative vote. But it's an interesting dynamic with, and I think Simon's already started to talk about the influence of UKIP and the dynamics coming through there, but also, of course, the Scottish National Party and the impact that they had as well.
We're definitely going to speak about the Scottish National Party as well as some other issues, including the EU referendum, because many say that the Conservatives' win could lead to big changes for Britain's relationship with the European Union. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, has promised to hold a referendum on the UK's membership in the EU by the end of 2017. Now, the Tories want to cut migration into the UK down to the tens of thousands, and they hope to do so by limiting benefits for immigrants. Well, under the proposed Conservative plans, migrants who stay unemployed in the UK for more than 6 months will be asked to leave. The Conservatives also want more power to deport criminals, and they've pushed to scrap the act that links UK courts to the European Court of Human Rights. Back to the issue of the EU referendum, Simon, David Cameron, as you know, has promised a referendum. Surely he can keep his promise after the results of this election.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's going to be a really interesting couple of years. I was reading something and speaking to a couple of people about this, and there are some people who suggest that this has to happen sooner rather than later because of the impact on the economy. That when the exit poll came out and it looked like that the exit poll was accurate, the pound started to rise and the economy seemed to be perception of the British economy started to be positive. But then there's Bloomberg in particular, they're concerned about the impact of this referendum. But one thing I just want to flag up is that I think it's probably inappropriate to talk about a singular Conservative policy on an EU referendum. I mean, we're dealing with lots of different perceptions, lots of different facets and factions within the Conservative Party, and their views on this are massively different.
Matthew, what do you make of that?
Well, I think Europe's certainly going to be a major issue that will dominate British politics for the next 2 to 3 years. David Cameron now has the numbers that he needs to push that issue through Parliament and to hold the referendum. He's also now, for the first time since 2012, really got room for manoeuvre on his Eurosceptic fringe because the poison in the sting that was the UK Independence Party has not been completely removed, but has certainly been softened by the outcome of the general election, which saw UKIP only win 1 seat. So Cameron is probably feeling pretty good about the Europe issue today, but he does face 2 challenges. One is that the European Union and the Commission have made it quite clear that they're not willing to give Cameron the changes and the reforms that he wants to see, in particular around the free movement of EU migrant workers. The second issue which is more of a domestic issue, which I think Simon has hinted towards, is his own parliamentary party. David Cameron will campaign most likely for Britain to stay in the EU, and many backbench Conservative MPs want Britain to leave the EU. So there will be a tension on the centre-right that will come to the surface. That will be magnified by the continuing activity of the sort of so-called hard Eurosceptics.
So then, Matthew, are you saying that Cameron's promise of a referendum then could have been just tactical?
Well, no. The promise of a referendum was made to try and heal what is a very deep split within the centre-right camp. Much as the electorate is fairly split when it comes to the referendum, not as evenly as the Conservative Party, but Cameron made this offer to try and speak to the concerns of his Eurosceptic opponents, both in UKIP and his own party.
Well, the other issue, of course, is Scotland. Is this the end of the Union? That is the question that a lot of people are asking after the Scottish National Party, or the SNP, saw its biggest win ever in a general election, as we were just saying. The party has taken 56 of the 59 seats allocated for Scotland in Britain's Parliament, largely at the expense of the Labour Party. Over the years, the SNP has been at odds with various British governments. And through its existence since 1934, the SNP only entered national politics after it won a by-election seat in 1967. It's had parliamentary representation ever since. One of the SNP's main platforms is to have Scotland break away from the UK to become an independent country. In September last year, a referendum was held on independence in which 55% of Scots said no to leaving the Union. In addition to independence, the SNP has worked to increase its power and autonomy within the UK. It's voiced strong opposition to cuts to public services, saying its infrastructure has been decimated by years of austerity. So, Tom, seeing that most SNP candidates won outright majorities in their districts, this suggests that Scottish support for independence has risen somewhat since that referendum that I was just referring to. What happened?
Not particularly, and I think it's clear to understand that this is a momentum that has been building going as far back as 2007, when the SNP first went into the Scottish Government, first of all as a minority administration, and they gained the credibility there from the electorate that allowed them to build on it and become the Scottish Government in their own right in 2011. But even in that, in that particular poll, that election, they were recording the 45% that was reflected in the Yes campaign. And so this isn't a flash in the pan that's developed. What's very significant about this one is that up until now, people were often inclined to vote differently in Scottish Government elections as opposed to Westminster elections. But for the first time, possibly because with a growing degree of frustration and disenchantment with the Labour Party in Scotland, the SNP were seen as a credible alternative. And their slogan of stronger for Scotland resonated very much amongst the electorate. And quite a bit of qualitative research work that we've done over the last few months has indicated that the number of people who voted no back in September last year, that they didn't want to break up with the UK, saw the need and in fact the requirement to vote SNP in this particular election to make sure that Scotland's voice continued to be heard. What will be interesting over the next year or possibly 2 years leading up, next year leading up to the Scottish Government elections, will be the extent to which these people will continue to either vote SNP to return them, and then will they carry that on to then vote yes if there's an independence referendum called. That's the big question mark, which I think will be the main focus for Scottish politics over the next 2 years.
Simon, go ahead. I see you want to interject.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the other thing that we need to factor in, of course, is that the SNP vote is also seen as an anti-austerity vote, and that historically, while Labour have seen to be the opposition to the Tories, Labour didn't really go far enough with its anti-austerity measures for many, and the SNP did. So I think that's something that we really need to factor in when we're understanding this, that it's not necessarily just about independence, but it's also about an anti-austerity message.
Matthew?
And I think, sorry, on you go, Matthew, sorry.
Well, I'd only add that I think what we've seen in Scotland is almost verging on a structural realignment of Scottish politics. That to build on the previous comment about this not just being a flash in the pan, we have seen over the last 24, 36 hours a wholesale rejection of the Labour Party by voters in Scotland, and I wouldn't view that so much as something in isolation as other trends that are also working against the Labour Party. You can pretty much run a straight line from the SNP and its challenge to Labour in Scotland down through some of those northern Labour constituencies in England, where lots of working class, older, white, struggling, pessimistic voters feel disconnected from Labour, and you can carry on right through to some of the Welsh constituencies, the South Welsh towns, industrial heartlands, or used to be industrial heartlands, where Labour also finds its support there is down by a third over the last 2 years. So, Miliband has resigned today. And I think whoever succeeds him as the leader of the Labour Party is going to be faced with some pretty big challenges that are going to come home in elections in Scotland next year, but also elections in Wales next year. So it's certainly a job that I wouldn't want to have.
Well, on the domestic front, the UK economy was one of the most prominent topics of this election. Rising oil prices and inflation could become a huge challenge for the new government, especially in light of the Tories' campaign promises. In its election manifesto, the Conservative Party has pledged to pay off the deficit by 2019 and move the UK into surplus by then, going as far as to say Britain will have the most prosperous major economy in the world by the 2030s. Well, the government plans to do all this while introducing tax-free childcare and pledging no increases in income tax. So, Tom, your view on the economy going forward and whether economic policies are going to remain the same, and will there be a continuation of austerity?
Well, there's been very much a claim from the Conservative government that they will want to continue along a similar line to that they've been following to, as they put it, to finish the job. But just to pick up on a point that Matthew made and to expand upon that, the dynamic between this block of 56 Scottish National Party MPs coming to Westminster, who very clearly are following a policy of anti-austerity, of not supporting the Conservatives, will be an interesting dynamic to observe, because if there had been a Labour-led government, there might well have been the opportunity for the SNP to influence directly some of the policies implemented. We have a situation now where they may well want certain policies, but in the sense the new Conservative government doesn't need to pander to them in terms of getting their support. They have the majority to get these policies through. The flip side of that, of course, is do the Conservatives want to take that hardball stance on the basis that that might actually speed up the whole process of Scotland seeking to become independent? So the economy and the Scottish situation is very closely intertwined here.
Simon, what do you make of the UK economy going forward after the win?
Sure, I just want to comment on something that both of my fellow panelists have touched on, and that's this idea that Matthew was talking about him not fancying the job of the Labour leader. Well, I don't so much fancy David Cameron's job right now of trying to unify the United Kingdom, in the sense that he's got these 56 SNP MPs, and he's got to try and somehow create unity amongst the United Kingdom. I think that's going to be incredibly difficult. But on the subject of the economy, well, I want to add a slightly different approach to this, and I want to just mention Trident. So Cameron's talked about renewing Trident, and that's going to cost, the figures that I saw, 100 billion over the next 35 years. So that's going to be a whole other dynamic that has to be factored in light of austerity measures that are still going to be taking place. And then if we put that in the context of these 56 SNP MPs, who have clearly got this very anti-Trident agenda, I think we've got another really interesting tension that starts to emerge.
Matthew, please go ahead and respond to what Simon said, and then I'd like to finally ask you, gentlemen, about foreign policy, something that we have not spoken about yet.
Well, I do think that's it's very interesting, and I'd probably expect David Cameron to essentially begin to call the SNP's bluff over the next few months and over the next year, and by that I mean possibly making an offer of some description to Scotland and the SNP, going much further than Cameron has gone until now, perhaps moving towards a far more federal type system, giving the SNP far greater control over tax, trade, the economy, finances, and in an era where the oil prices are rather low at the moment and very volatile, I think the pessimist in me would say that some Conservatives may try to quite deliberately take the shine off the SNP insurgency by saying, well, you guys be the unpopular insiders for a while. It's very easy to be the populist, successful outsider. It's not very easy to be the insider. And, those elections next year in Scotland, don't forget, for the first time, the SNP really will be having to campaign on a different platform from what it campaigned on at this general election, which will be a platform of standing by its record. And actually, if you look at what the SNP has done in Scotland, it is not as dynamic and as entrepreneurial as some SNP candidates would have you believe. And I think the longer that the SNP remains in that position, it's going to have to adapt its narrative from being this populist, anti-establishment, anti-austerity alternative to actually having to stand by what it's done in government. It's a much harder position to defend.
Tom, I need to just draw your attention to foreign policy for just a moment. Let's widen this discussion. Do you expect to see any major changes when it comes to foreign policy?
I wouldn't think so, although it's not an area of specialism because we very much focus on domestic politics. I think obviously the European question will be by far the one that dominates. And I think the interesting point is that in the run-up to this election, we were monitoring on a regular basis the key issues that the electorate were considering as being important in deciding how to vote. And I have to say to you that the European Union and whether Britain was stayed a member or not was fairly well down that list. Having said that, though,
what about immigration policies? What about immigration policies?
Yeah, I was just about to say that immigration was in the top 5 in terms of how it was handled. So it's how you dice up and look at the whole issue about Europe and immigration. But I would think that's obviously going to be a key agenda item over the next year.
Surely, Simon, that foreign policy is key for the government, especially in today's climate.
Sure, yeah. I think we've got an increasingly volatile international system. We've got a resurgent Russia. We've got a really complex situation in Ukraine. We've got the ISIL question. We've got this interesting EU-UK dynamic. Clearly, the US has a vested interest in this as well. Foreign policy is going to be at the heart of the next government's agenda, but as Tom was saying, it's not really manifesting in voter concerns.
And Matthew, your take on foreign policy and where it factors in?
Well, I think Britain's had a very interesting few years in terms of its foreign policy experience, whether in Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, and almost Syria. We have increasingly become quite an insular nation, returning to our old days perhaps of splendid isolation in terms of actively now avoiding any sort of meaningful or assertive commitment that extends beyond overseas aid and international development. And if you look, for example, at the refugee crisis in the Mediterranean as one example, the UK has been far more passive than it probably would have been during the era of Tony Blair or Gordon Brown. So we have certainly become less prominent on the world stage. I do a lot of work at Chatham House, and their conclusion from this general election again is that Britain is likely to have a reduced level of influence in the global arena, especially within the EU, where we are increasingly marginalised, but also in the global arena, where we're simply not a major league competitor to the same extent that we were in perhaps the 1980s and 1990s.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. All my guests out of London, Tom Costley, Simon Mabon and Matthew Goodwin. Thanks very much. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. We'd love to hear your thoughts. As always, you can get in touch with us on our program page at aljazeera.com. You can also post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, the whole team here in Doha, goodbye for now.